Hey, in this session, I want to move from a more theoretical conversation about what the Bible is and begin thinking about what it actually contains. And in particular, I want to think about the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, and really reflect on what is contained in there. Now, I think one of the best ways that we can begin to work through something like that is because it's this massive, massive library of stuff. Okay, now there are 39 books in the Old Testament, and they are diverse both in terms of the timing which they were written, the particular theological emphases that they, are advancing, and also their genre, like the kind of literature that is contained there. We have narratives, we have discourse, prose kind of stuff, we have legal code, and then we have things like the poetic pieces. And we really can't minimize any piece of those. Okay, like each of those components plays its part in the whole structure of what's going on in the Old Testament. Now, I think it's important for us to have some idea of the basic narrative that goes there, and I think that a narrative that begins by thinking about creation and then the corruption of that creation, God's covenant with particular people to advance, to kind of bring about redemption in the world, and then what it means for God's people to be kind of located in a place, and the kingdom narrative, even though it's broader, there's kingdom strictly speaking, and then kind of an understanding about the what happens in the exile. Like those particular moments, I think, are a great structure. Although you really just kind of decide, are we going to have like 3 or 4 or 10 moments that we're going to highlight as we identify the structure? But I think that's one particular way of doing it that can be effective. But just as much as organizing it by those things, by that kind of narrative. Well, let me just say this. First of all, that organizing it with a narrative like that gives us the opportunity to then have a broader understanding of what God is doing in the world and throughout the whole story. Now, ultimately, we're going to relate to that in the next session. We're going to relate that story to what we read about in the New Testament, what God does in the person of Jesus. But in this part of the story in the Old Testament, I think we tie together this coherent narrative, and then there are rabbit trails of like little narratives that go along, maybe side stories, and then there's poetry that maybe evokes certain kinds of emotions and experiences and raises certain kinds of questions, but they all fit into that narrative. Not that they're necessarily advancing the plot of the narrative, but they're advancing the important arc of God's mission in the world. Okay, so those pieces, like the poetry pieces, which are meant to create a certain kinds of character, are part of the narrative in which God is forming a people who will be His partners and bringing about goodness in the world. And that's a very important piece of this. As we look through what kind of structure we have, just like we talked about with the philosophical kind of approach to Scripture, we need to have a narrative that's big enough that it can hold all the pieces. All the little stories need to be able to play their part in one way or another, and some of those little stories like really stretch our ability to do that. However, when we start off with a structure, we're not necessarily trying to, thread each piece of the story in like it's a bead on a particular string, okay, like a necklace or something like that. Instead, what we're doing is we have this larger, I guess, flow of the narrative, and then we ask whether the individual pieces, if we hold them up into that flow, if they kind of work with the same trajectory or not. Okay, because truth is, some of the when we think about structuring our knowledge of the Old Testament, like as on a timeline, which is a narrative structure, okay, then we have to recognize that certain pieces of those books, like, take a random psalm, like how does Psalm, 41, fit into a timeline structure? Well, it may not, in a way, but it does fit into the narrative structure of God bringing, forming a people and being in partnership with the people who are asking certain kinds of questions and who are learning what it means to be faithful in certain ways, learning what it means to be good and just and right. So that's what we're trying to do in this particular section, and it's just important for us to have that conversation about how we see the general narrative. Now, one important part of that is that sometimes you'll see stories that leave out certain things. Like in the piece that I just mentioned, like I kind of glossed over like the Exodus, even though the Exodus is, I'm thinking about it as part of God establishing the people, okay, as a community in the land. But we have to also say that it kind of, I mean, it really deserves its own, hook in as a moment in and of itself too. But one that often, gets discarded is the exile. And the exile is like this huge moment. I don't know, like 40% of the Old Testament revolves around the Israel's relationship to the empires that are in play. I don't know. I mean, it's a huge portion of the text. All the great prophets, all the great collections of poetry like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all that stuff, revolves around what's going on with Israel's and Judah's relationships with the empires around them and the crushing blows that those empires deal to them. And so, I think it's important to include that because not only is it an important part of the narrative, and are there a lot of the books devoted to it. I mean, think about how much more is written about the exile than is the the fall story, okay? And think about which one of those was really the big issue for the people that produced these documents. Any rate, so I want to look at the structure that we create, and we have to kind of look back into it and say, well, does that structure, is it faithful to what we actually find in the text? Not just is it faithful to the theological story that we know as Christians, but is it a coherent telling of what we actually see in the text? And I think this idea of a creation, even though the creation story itself is very short, in some ways, the whole of the Old Testament is a creation story. It's a conversation about, it's a reflection about what it means for Israel's God to be the one who created the whole world and is sovereign over the whole world, even in the face of these, the breakdown and the violence that we experience. And then you have this corruption moment in which humans, even though they're created to be God's partners in the world, are actually agents of evil and disorder and violence and death. And then think about what it means for God to call, a specific group of people who will, rejoin Him in partnership and mission, and then kind of rising and falling of those people through their experiences of being a kingdom and their experiences of exile. I believe that story gives us a lot of room to learn and to develop our understanding of what's happening in the Scriptures. And that's what really we're after. We want a narrative framework that allows us to enter into that story, learn, and grow from our engagement with it. So I think this 5-part piece of creation, corruption, covenant, kingdom, and then exile provides us a mechanism for doing that. Okay, hope it's useful to you.